and terrifying, because once you leave the bell, it's completely pitch black all around you, so there's no reference point of how fast you're going or even how close to the ground you are. And so it feels like you're just sinking into this endless abyss before you crash into the ground. Once Chris and Dave did hit the ground, they stood up and began walking, and they were directed by the radio in their helmet which direction they needed to go to reach this oil platform. The oil platform was 11 meters tall, and it looked like a sort of pyramid of these big steel pipes. They climbed up the side until they reached their respective working area, and then they settled in to do their job, which they expected to take about 6 hours. At first, everything was going to plan, but about an hour into the job, something went terribly wrong with the surface. The dynamic positioning computer failed. Now, the captain immediately saw it and just expected the backup computer to kick in and take over. But in a terrible turn of luck, the backup computer also failed. And so very quickly, this huge dive ship began drifting.
Look at how it works, Lacey. Look.
With it, the dive bell and the divers 330 feet below. While the captain struggled to try to fix the system and get it back online and get the ship back on station, another crew member hopped up the radio and called down to Dave and Chris, who were outside of the dive bell, and told them to abandon the structure and get back in the bell ASAP. And Chris and Dave could tell from the urgency in this person's voice, this was no drill, this was serious. Chris and Dave were both positioned on the south side of the structure about halfway up, and their umbilicals were running straight up the structure and then northward because the ship was drifting northward. So neither Chris nor Dave could go around the structure. They needed to go straight up before being able to climb their umbilicals back up. And so both men began climbing, but they could feel the tension on their umbilicals getting tighter and tighter, and Dave managed to get all the way to the top, and he cleared the lip, and as soon as he was on top, he started getting pulled away from the structure. And he looked to see if Chris was also getting pulled, and all he saw was Chris's umbilical, impossibly stretched, still draped over the south side, and he could not see Chris. And that's when Dave, Duncan, and all the people on the surface heard Chris come over the radio frantically saying he was stuck on the underwater structure. His umbilical had gotten wrapped around one of the pylons. And so through the radio, Chris asked Duncan to give him more slack. But Duncan said, there is no more slack. We are completely tight here. You have to get it free. And Chris would say, I can't unfree it. It keeps getting tighter and tighter. I can't get it off the pylon. And so Dave jumped down onto the platform and tried to pull himself over to Chris, but his own umbilical was getting pulled towards the dive bell, and so he could not help Chris. And so Dave knew he couldn't do anything, so he turned and began crawling up his umbilical towards the dive bell, and as he's climbing, he hears behind him this extremely loud explosion. It sounded like a shotgun going off, and what it was Chris's umbilical snapping under the tension. As soon as the umbilical snapped, it sent Chris flying backwards off the structure, falling towards the ocean floor. Without his umbilical, he wouldn't have had light, he wouldn't have had a radio to talk to anybody up on the boat, he wouldn't have had heat, and the water was just barely above freezing, and so he would have been very cold very fast, and he would not have had an air supply. Although he would have had 2 backup canisters on his back that would automatically turn on, however, they only gave him 5 or maybe 6 minutes of air. And so when Chris hit the ocean floor, it would have been eerily quiet and totally, completely pitch black. He stood up at some point and looked around him and didn't see anything, but knew he had to get back to the underwater structure. It was his only chance of anybody finding him again. And so he had to make the impossible decision of just choosing a direction and blindly walking, not having any idea what you're walking towards. Choose wrong and you might walk over a cliff. But at some point, Chris made up his mind and just began walking in a single direction, and miraculously, he walked into the underwater structure. He climbed up the side until he got to the top, which was a flat metal grate, and there he looked around and saw there was no dive bell, there was no sign of anything. It was just him. He was completely all alone. And he must have known at this point that he was running out of air. He probably had maybe 1 or 2 minutes left. And so he would have been acutely aware